I used to be skeptical about this issue of the dangers of radiation from wireless technology. And then I even saw evidence of it in my own home. My former partner had a very serious heart condition, and every time he spent time on the Wi-Fi, he decided to bring Wi-Fi into our house for his business, and when he would sit near the router and with the Wi-Fi on, after 2 hours he would get dangerous arrhythmias, significantly strong, so as to trigger his problems with with the ventricular system in his heart, and then his defibrillator would go off and he'd end up in the hospital. At the same time, my son, who was a young teenager, he lived for sports and was doing extremely well in school, and about very shortly after the Wi-Fi was brought into our house, he started complaining of not being able to sleep at night, wake up with headaches, a sick stomach, brain fog, and I thought it was teenage hormones. And with my husband, my former partner, when he was having all these arrhythmias and his defibrillator going off, I thought he was sneaking chocolate and coffee. The two things, along with red wine, that his cardiologist at the Mayo Clinic told him he had to avoid at all costs if he wanted to stay alive. And he would have these episodes, and I thought he was sneaking coffee when I was at work. But it turns out it wasn't. And it wasn't until many more friends of mine have come forward to me and told me about their electrosensitivity that I began to think, maybe there's something to this, and I started reading scientific literature about the subject, and then I started to think, probably this is behind a lot of the problems that we're seeing. So this spring, back in March, there was a proposal by Freedom Mobile to put a tower on top of a light standard at the corner of Beecher Street and McBride, right outside a building that houses 3 wellness industries, businesses. And one of those business owners came to me and said, if this thing goes ahead, my business is finished. This lady was running a hairdressing salon, and she catered to people who were chemically sensitive and electrosensitive as well. She and her partner had spent thousands and thousands of dollars making changes to their studio, the hairdressing salon, so that people who were electrosensitive could be in there to get their hair done and not be bombarded by EMFs, dangerous EMFs. They didn't have Wi-Fi in their facility, and people would come from as far away as Squamish and way out the valley in Chilliwack. Some people were coming up from Seattle to get their hair done there because they could be safe from electromagnetic radiations that were harmful. So this lady found out from the restaurant across the road about this proposal to put this big tower in. Nobody got notice in her building, and her building was right adjacent to where that tower would go. Nobody in that building, not even the building owner, got notice, but the people across the street running the restaurant, they got notice. They came and showed her the notice, and she went, holy crap, my business is finished. So I helped her get organized. We got the Crescent Beach Property Owners Association engaged. The Freedom Mobile people came. They put on a presentation there. They were professional, they were courteous. You couldn't have asked for more pleasant people to come. And during their presentation, they let it slip that prior to their proposal, TELUS had put 20, count them, 20 microcell towers throughout Crescent Beach at various locations. Well, the audience let out a gasp of shock and dismay. How could this happen without them being given any notice or a chance to say anything about this? The good news to this story is that Freedom Mobile could see how upset the residents were, and they withdrew their proposal to put that big tower at the corner of Beecher and McBride. But the fact still remains that we have these 20 microcell towers peppered throughout Crescent Beach, and they went up without notice. And that's the whole point of this. How can it happen that something as dangerous as this technology is be installed in our neighborhoods to bombard us with the stuff without us getting notice? Now, it's one thing when you bring Wi-Fi into your house. You're taking a risk. You make a decision, a conscious decision to bring it into your home. But when these microcell antennae are put on utility poles outside your kid's bedroom, and your kid is being exposed to what you're going to hear about in a few minutes from Dr. Pall, you have no choice. What can you do? Move to another place where somebody's going to throw up another one of these towers? I think it's time for us to speak out in a big, loud voice. Our elected officials need to know about this, and they need to be accountable and responsible for their actions, and they need to take instruction from us about this. And so I think we have a moral obligation, and thank you to every one of you in this room, because you are fulfilling that moral obligation to your families and to future generations. So without any more from me, I'm going to turn the mic over to Paul LeMay, a science writer who will introduce Dr. Martin Pall.
Right, so my name is Paul LeMay. Thank you again for all coming out. I have some affinity to this community. I actually lived in White Rock during 2005 and a part of 2006, and I was active in trying to get the train line that we have on the foreshore, the BNSF line, relocated to an inland route. And that's a different topic. This is a very different topic. So I now live in Vancouver, and in fact my health before I moved to Vancouver was relatively fine. In 1983, I was diagnosed with a heart arrhythmia condition known as paroxysmal atrial fibrillation. And it was relatively stable for quite a few years, in fact, for about 3 decades. And what happened was, I would only have about 3 or 4 incidents a year at the max. And I was running marathons, I was riding my bike for quite long distances, going to the gym, had a very normal active lifestyle. So, lo and behold, I move out of White Rock and I move into Vancouver. And little did I know that I lived within 300 meters of the Lululemon building, which, if you know, down on Cornwall and Burrard, has quite a few numbers of antennae, cell phone antennae. So like Pixie, I was really unaware of a lot of this, even though I was a science writer. I didn't give it much thought to wireless radiation in any way. So in 2006, I'm in Vancouver, and slowly but surely, my arrhythmia rate started to climb. And then in 2014 came the year from Hades, and in that year, my heart really started to act up. In fact, it went from, as I say, 3 to 4 incidents a year to about 5 or 6 a week. And I found myself at St. Paul's Hospital for an 8-day stay, and I had an ablation. But just prior to having the ablation, I was brought to an MRI for a diagnosis, or just a scan, in order to determine what the structure of my heart was before the procedure. And during that, just shortly after that MRI had taken place, about 5-10 minutes afterwards, I was in my hospital room, and my heart went spiking up, what's called tachycardia. It's your heart racing. My heart went up to about 205 beats a minute while I was resting. And my life was effectively saved by a calcium channel blocker drug. Now I mention that calcium channel drug because the calcium channels are going to be one of the themes that comes up in this talk by Dr. Pall this afternoon. And not too long after I got home from the hospital, being a science writer, I often start to look into things on my own. And I dug into the literature, and lo and behold, I found an article by Martin Pall, our guest speaker today. And it was on voltage-gated calcium channels, which is quite a mouthful for a lot of us. So I won't get into the technical stuff, because he'll do that. But when I did speak to him, I actually found his phone number, and I gave him a call, and we actually spoke on the phone. And he had said to me I was very lucky that I didn't die that day because of that MRI. The MRI essentially had pushed me over the edge. My body had already been assaulted over and over and over again. And also after this, I wrote a letter to St. Paul's Hospital, as a matter of fact, I didn't mention it to you, that to explain to them one of the risks, and I actually sent them a copy of the article that he had published. Whether they acted on it or not, I have no idea. But I could have sued the hospital. I could have, maybe I still will. But I had gratitude for the hospital and its services, so I wasn't in any kind of punitive mood. I just wanted to resolve the problem. And so the other thing that happened, and Farron Lander is here today, my landlord stepped forward and we did an assessment of the apartment I lived in. And Farron found that my apartment was really quite riddled with a lot of this stuff. And there was a hot spot in the living room. We had Wi-Fi. I'm in an apartment building on the second floor, so I'm sandwiched between a third floor and a first floor. I got Wi-Fi upstairs, Wi-Fi downstairs, Wi-Fi of the next door neighbor, 2 next door neighbors, and the cell phone tower, and we had Wi-Fi in our house, and we had cordless phones, and we had cell phone. Not mine, but my partner's. So here I was, you know, it was like saturation city. And so finally, we mitigated the apartment. My landlord stepped forward, and if you can believe it, at a great act of compassion, she spent $25,000 renovating my apartment, did not raise my rent, and the hotspot was 700 to 1100 microwatts per square meter. Now that doesn't mean anything to any of us if we're not familiar with this area. So by comparison, so the hotspot is 700 to 1100 microwatts per square meter. And it dropped down to 7 to 9 microwatts per square meter after mitigation. That's like 1,000. So so Farron had said, you know, Paul, it's now as quiet electromagnetically. It's as quiet in your apartment as it being in a forest in the mountains. It's pretty astounding, eh? What a difference. And in the years that have followed, my heart arrhythmia condition has steadily improved in terms of fewer incidents. Yes, the ablations were helpful, but they didn't totally resolve the problem because it didn't address the cause. It addressed a symptom. And as my condition has improved, I'm able to organize a talk like this. So what precipitated this talk for me? My landlord, the same landlord that helped mitigate my apartment, came to me in January and said, I've been reading a bunch of articles on 5G, and I'm really very concerned. I'm actually horrified about what I'm reading, and I want you to dig into this. So here again, I knew nothing about 5G. It was all new to me, and I started reading on the topic. And next thing I know, as I keep reading, I'm seeing more things. Not just the popular press, I want you to understand. I was going into the science literature. And I was thinking, this is really horrific. It really, truly is horrific. And then I remembered Martin Pall's name. It just popped into my head one day, and I thought, you know what, I'm going to call him. I'm going to bug him again. And I invited him. I asked him if he would be prepared to come to Vancouver to give a public talk on this issue. And he agreed, which was great. And what happened was, though, other people in other communities soon found out that we were going to do this. Found out in Salt Spring Island, they found out in Victoria, they found out in Duncan, they found out in Naniamo, they found out in Bowen Island. And I knew none of the folks. And they all wanted Martin Pall. So what turned out was going to start out to be just one public talk for Vancouver, turned into a tour of 7 cities. A nice number, 7 cities. And so this is the final public talk on the tour. And what's really wonderful about all of this is that Martin did not ask for a speaker's fee. He's retired. He came here out of the goodness of his heart and the concern for our health. So I think we all are. And before I forget, I'm just seeing my friend Fanny Starchild in the back, and she was serenading us, by the way, with harp music when you came in, and I really want to thank you for that, Fanny. Now, just before I ask Martin to come up here, I was going through my notes this morning looking for something that was related to some other topic, but I came across a note from the city of Vancouver. You may or may not know this, but the city of Vancouver and the city of Surrey are in a competition to see which city will become the smartest city fastest. And what they mean by smartest city, which is an abuse of the word smartest, is by installing 5G microcell antennae all over your neighborhoods. And as Pixie has mentioned, part of the problem we have in Canada is that there are regulations for notifying the public when you put up a big cell phone tower mast. But when it comes to these antennae, these small antennae that they're putting in neighborhoods, anything that's below 15 meters, is not requiring any notification. There's an exemption in the regulations. And that's one of the things we're going to be asking very specifically with our MPs. Remove all of those exemptions. If there's any kind of broadcasting antenna that's put in your neighborhood, you have a right to know the fact that it's coming into your neighborhood, because guess what? The public airwaves are public property. That's why we have the CRTC. They do not belong to the telecoms. They actually auction off those areas of spectrum in order for those things to occur. And it's only because it's actually our property, and the government has to ask us if we want to auction off those areas of spectrum. They have not. Good news is, in Canada, we have not yet auctioned off the 5G spectrum. Yes, we have a chance to stop this before it's rolled out. The only thing is, 4G technology, which is the precursor to 5G, is being rolled out with these neighborhood cell antennae, the microcell antennae. They're like Wi-Fi, but they're on steroids. Wi-Fi on steroids, so to speak. I know Carl will probably correct me on that terminology. He doesn't like that term. But anyways, I do want to mention the final thing. In Vancouver, the city of Vancouver is already in a contract with TELUS, where they're providing free Wi-Fi for the public. And there are literally 500 free Wi-Fi sites throughout the city of Vancouver. And in 2017, they claimed there was 280,000 people who accessed those Wi-Fi units. The one thing about 5G that we need to be aware of, it's not just about the antennae that they're going to install out on the periphery of your property that might only be 20 or 30 or 40 meters from your bedroom window or your child's bedroom window. It is that it's supposed to communicate with all the smart devices in your home. And one statistic that I saw from the United States says when those smart appliances and smart milk containers are starting to pick up and send their information, you may have up to 500 transmitting devices in your house, in addition to whatever Wi-Fi you have in your house, or a cordless phone, or whatever. So just keep that in mind in terms of exposures that you might be facing literally in the next possible 2 years. So, without any further ado, yes, people, if you have, I'm being reminded visually, if you have, there's no Wi-Fi on in this building, which is great news. We have some people here today who are electrosensitive. I would ask you all to turn off your cell phones if you have a cell phone, just like going to a movie. We all know what it means. You go to a movie, you turn off your cell phone. And it's also a pain, when people are in the midst of a talk and the thing is ringing, everybody gets distracted. So Dad was a Canadian as well, in Winnipeg. He was from Winnipeg. And at 5 years of age, he went to the United States. He was raised in the Chicago area. I found out about that yesterday. And then he went on to go to university at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he initially went into pre-med with the intention of becoming a doctor. And like many of us, when we go to university, first subject we take, we often assume that that's the thing we're going to specialize in when we're older. And it actually doesn't turn out to be that way. As we move through the process, we realize that we're actually interested in something else. So Martin got very interested in chemistry and in physics, and finished his undergraduate degree, if you can believe it, at 20 years of age. So, and then he went on to do his PhD at Caltech University, and went into the area he now is a specialist in, which is biochemistry. I mentioned the fact that he was in physics in undergrad because it's very rare in a lot of academia for someone to be having a background in both physics and in biology. But when it comes to this specific issue, it becomes very important because silo mentality is part of the reason we're in the pickle we're in. A lot of engineers and physicists who are in the telecom industry have no background, no training of any type in biology. So they just assume there are no biological effects. And they're quite confident in their knowledge, or what they think is the scientific knowledge. And in fact, they're not. And that's one of the things I think Martin will explain to you, that this was a surprise to him as well after he retired in 2013. So Martin, I hope that's welcome to Surrey, and thank you for coming, and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you for all of you for coming out. Yeah, we're all facing what I think is the crisis of our lives, and we all need to educate ourselves about it. So I appreciate the opportunity to be visible. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about three things today that kind of interact with each other. One of the things I'll be talking about are the safety guidelines, including Canada's so-called Safety Code 6, and why the safety guidelines do not predict biological effects and therefore do not predict safety. And I'll show you 8 different types of evidence that clearly show that. And I will also be talking about how a variety of different EMFs impact the cells of our bodies and produce a large number of different health impacts. And then we're going to talk about 5G and why we have every expectation that 5G will be vastly more dangerous than anything else that we've been previously exposed to. And many of our exposures are already having very large effects on our bodies. So let's go to the next slide. So there are a whole series of what have been called safety guidelines, and they all derive from these 1998 IGNIRP safety guidelines. IGNIRP is the International Commission on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection. This was an organization that was set up by the industry to suggest what kinds of safety guidelines we should have, so these guidelines here, which are identical to the current EU, the UK, Australian safety guidelines, and are very similar to the US FCC and Health Canada's Safety Code 6. So they're all quite similar, and I'm just going to talk about these and show you how they are deeply flawed. So each of these are averaged over 6 minutes. They take an average intensity over a 6-minute period. And in fact, some of these safety guidelines actually use 30 minutes instead of 6 minutes, which is even worse. And so one of the questions that we'll be asking is, does averaging over 6 minutes make any sense? Does that, in what way does that tell us anything about safety? A second thing about this is that the allowable exposures are based on this thing called SAR. SAR stands for specific absorption rate. That is a measure of how much heating a particular EMF produces in our bodies, okay? So the only thing that these things are designed to protect us from are heating or thermal effects. They do not protect us from non-thermal effects, but in fact there are many non-thermal effects that occur at with exposures orders of magnitude below the allowed levels of the safety guidelines, and that's one of the things that we'll be talking about. Now we have occupational exposures and general public exposures. The occupational exposures are 5 times higher than the general public exposures. It's not really clear why that should be, because the people in these occupations really have no way of protecting themselves any more than we do. But that's the situation. And one of the other things that's a bit peculiar about these is that the whole body exposures are much lower than partial body exposures. These are 25 times higher and 50 times higher, when in fact we know that many of these effects occur at the level of individual cells. So the individual cells of our bodies don't really care whether we're exposed to whole body exposures or partial body exposures. They have the same kind of reactions. So it's not really clear what the rationale is for having 25 times or 50 times higher exposures being allowed. So the ones I'm going to talk about are these lowest ones, these whole body general public exposures, and we're going to compare what those things predict with what actually happens in our bodies. And I'm going to talk about now 8 different types of evidence on this, and why don't we go to the first type. So there are many non-thermal effects that have been reported over and over and over again, and so each of these are documented in a large numbers of published review articles. So here they're 25 and 29 and 24 and 16, or 15 rather. So lots and lots of different, huge amounts of evidence on these. So what do we see? We see lowered fertility of various types, and I'm going to talk about these later on in a little bit more detail. But you can see there are many, many effects on fertility in humans and in animals. There are also neurological and neuropsychiatric effects. And again, there are lots of different things going on here. And when you study the situation in animals, you find that there are major changes in the structure of the brains that occur over time. And so, and all of these are occurring at levels far, far below safety guidelines, and including Canada's Safety Code 6. You get cellular DNA damage. You get damage through the DNA of our cells, 24 reviews on that, of 3 different types. And these are all have important roles in causing both cancer and germline mutations. And let me just say, we know that human sperm is impacted by EMFs that we're exposed to all the time in terms of the DNA damage. And those then can cause mutations in babies that are born where the sperm fertilizer is used. So we know that Wi-Fi radiation and cell phone radiation produce high levels of DNA damage in human sperm. And there are other kinds of DNA exposures we already have that also cause damage in the cells of our bodies. So we have what's called apoptosis. This is programmed cell death, and this is something that has an important role in producing the reproductive and the neurodegenerative effects. Can you? Okay, so let's go to the next slide. And so we also have oxidative stress and free radical damage. These have roles in essentially all chronic diseases in humans and in animals. 25 reviews on that. We have many different endocrine, that is hormonal effects. As far as I can tell, every single hormone system in the body is impacted by these EMFs. And we have excessive intracellular calcium, which is, I'll show you later, is the cause of almost everything else. So this is very important. 16 reviews on that. We have 38 reviews on cancer. And yet we're still arguing whether cancer is occurring as a function of these EMF exposures. The only reason we're arguing about this is because the industry has such power that it basically can shed discredit on things, even though the evidence here is absolutely overwhelming. And you know, I mean, you got 38 different reviews on this, basically arguing that EMFs cause basically all of the steps that are involved in cancer. You know, there should be no question. There are cardiac effects, and we've already had discussions of those. These involve the electrical control of the heart, and they produce tachycardia, bradycardia, so both fast heartbeat and slow heartbeat under different circumstances, and arrhythmias. And these can cause sudden cardiac death. And there is evidence from animal studies, in fact, that EMFs can cause sudden cardiac death. So we shouldn't be surprised if that same thing occurs in humans. Okay, so so we have here 197 review articles, 179 bodies of evidence that show substantial effects at EMF intensities far below our current safety guidelines. So, you know, anyone arguing for the safety guidelines must show that each of these 197 bodies of evidence are deeply flawed. And of course, they don't do that, and they can't do that. So we live in this gaga land where there are claims of safety that simply have no scientific merit whatsoever. Now, this is just one type of evidence, all of these, for the failure of the safety guidelines to predict biological effects. I'm going to talk about 7 others. So let's go on. And one of the findings is that pulsed EMFs are, in most cases, much more biologically active than our non-pulsed, also known as continuous wave EMFs, of the same average intensities. There are 13 published reviews on that. And so why is that important? Well, it's very important because all wireless communication devices communicate via pulsations. They are potentially, and I believe actually, much more dangerous as a consequence of that. The smarter the device, the more it pulses, and therefore the more dangerous it will be, okay? And when you go to smart cities, you're gonna have gigantic amounts of pulsations. So, you know, this is the crazy world we live in. And so pulsations, as you've already seen, the safety guidelines, as you've already seen, do not take into consideration the role of pulsations. But pulsations are very, very important. So the safety guidelines are deeply flawed for that reason as well. And this is a particularly big flaw with regard to 5G, because 5G is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed and will therefore be vastly more dangerous as a consequence. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this slide has to do with a particular range of pulses called nanosecond pulses. So nanosecond pulses are pulses between 1 nanosecond, that's 1/1000th of a second, and 1 microsecond, 1/1,000,000th of a second. And we know that there have been many studies done on nanosecond pulses where it's been shown that they produce effects, and a lot of these effects have been studied at the level of individual cells, including some of the things we've discussed before that occur at the level of individual cells. And so, the problem here is that, of course, the safety guidelines that we talk about use average intensities over 6 minutes. So if you take a typical, let's say, 40 nanosecond pulse, and you average it over 6 minutes, what are you doing? You're averaging it over a period that's 10 to the 10th times longer, that is 10 billion times longer. Now, when you do that, of course, what's going to happen? The average intensity will decrease by a factor of 10 billion, right? And when the safety guidelines then look at these things, they say, oh, they cannot possibly produce any effects, but they do, and they do over and over and over again. So we have here, again, a massive failure of the safety guidelines to reflect what's actually going on in our real biology. And what I've done here is to sort of talk about a parallel sort of false logic that might be used in a different situation, just to show how incredibly false the logic is that are used in these safety guidelines. Let's say that I'm afraid that I'm going to be shot by a high-powered rifle bullet that travels over 700 meters per second. And that rifle bullet takes about 50 microseconds to injure my body, probably worse than injure my body. And so you go to the regulatory agency and you say, hey, I'm afraid this is going to cause real damage, right? And what do they say? And they say, well, don't worry. If you just average the force of the bullet over 10 billion times longer, which happens to be about 75 days, then the force is so low it can't possibly do anything. So this is the kind of logic that all of these agencies, whether it be Canada's, the Health Canada, or whether you're talking about the US FCC or the EU or any of the others, are using here, and it's total lunacy, of course. Let's go on. Any 5G system communicating with the Internet of Things, which is what they talk about, will inevitably have trillions of nanosecond pulses. And what I haven't said anything about is that paired nanosecond pulses are actually still more active than the sum of the two individually. So you're going to have, you know, hundreds of billions of paired nanosecond pulses in 5G radiation. So they are going to be vastly more active. And of course, the safety guidelines completely ignore the possibilities that these things can produce effects. So you've got and one of the things you're seeing here is that every time we look at real data, the safety guidelines fail and fail massively. I'm going to show you several other examples of that. Let's go on. Okay, so there's three more fatal flaws here. One is, and I have to kind of gesticulate about this. You know, we have, of course, exposures over huge ranges of intensities, right? And what has been found is that there are certain ranges of intensities that have been called exposure windows, where you get very, very high effects within a specific range of intensities of a particular EMF, okay? So you get very high effects. When you go lower, that is below that range, or higher above that range, they drop way, way down, okay? And what does that tell you? It tells you, first of all, that you can't assume just because you have a higher exposure that it's going to have a higher effect. It may have, in fact, a much lower effect. And so these are, what we're talking about here is what's called a dose-response curve. You have very, very complex dose-response curves. You simply cannot predict what's going to happen from some simple-minded safety guideline, such as what we have. And you even have situations where you have very, very high-level effects from these windows that are down something like 100,000 times below the safety guidelines. You can get very high effects at 100,000 times below something like 100,000 times below the safety guidelines. So again, they don't predict biological effects at all. And in addition to that, this is something I want to point out. If you're going to do averaging, which is what they do, averaging only makes sense if you have a linear dose-response curve. If you don't have a linear dose-response curve, which we clearly do not, it makes no sense to look at average intensities. But that's, of course, exactly what the safety guidelines do. So here again, this is, we live in this world of lunacy here, where the safety guidelines simply make no sense. Okay, there are a couple other things I'm just going to talk about very briefly. When we've had particular research groups examining different cell types, so of course we have many different types of cells in our bodies, and you can look at different cell types and ask, how do they respond to EMF exposures? And what you find, using a particular kind of methodology, for all these different cell types, you find some cells are much more sensitive than others to EMF effects. The safety guidelines completely ignore this huge heterogeneity among the cells of our bodies. But what this says is you cannot ignore that. You have to pay attention to the actual biological effects. And they're completely ignoring them. So that's another failure, a massive failure in the safety guidelines. We also have some things called frequency windows, which again produce extraordinarily strong effects, very specific frequencies. And when you go a little bit further away on the frequencies, you find that they drop way down. And so, so there's another thing that, again, is completely inconsistent with the safety guidelines. Okay, so let's go on. Let's see. So, and this is my own work, and I think it was referred to earlier. How are non-thermal effects actually produced? And they're produced, and what was shown was that there were 28, actually there's more than 28, I know of at least a dozen more studies that have shown that these non-thermal effects, and these occur from various frequencies, and I'll talk about them down below. So various frequencies of EMFs. You can block or greatly lower the effects with these calcium channel blockers. Okay, so what are calcium channel blockers? They are drugs that are specific for blocking voltage-gated calcium channels. And I abbreviate those VGCCs, so I don't have to talk so much about voltage-gated calcium channels. And so what are these, and what do they do in the cells of our bodies? Okay. Now it turns out that, as far as I can tell, every cell in our body has some of these VGCCs in them. They have different amounts and different types, but they all have at least some of them. And so, as you probably know, every cell in our body is surrounded by a membrane called the plasma membrane. So the plasma membrane is the thing that separates what's inside the cell from everything in the world that's outside the cell. And so that plasma membrane is very important. And these channels are in the plasma membrane, they're protein molecules in the plasma membrane, and they have the property then, these VGCCs, that when they open up, they allow huge amounts of calcium to flow into the cell. And most of the effects are produced by the excessive calcium in the cell, okay? So what we have here is a situation where, and I want to say, in the intracellular calcium levels are normally about 1/10,000th of the extracellular calcium level. So you got 10,000 times as much calcium outside the cell than inside the cell. That tells you a couple of things, I think. It tells you, first of all, it's important for the cells to keep calcium levels low most of the time. And so you shouldn't be too surprised that when you allow huge amounts of calcium flow in the cell, it causes all kinds of problems. And we'll talk about a lot of those problems. The second thing is that, you can, these channels do have functions, and they basically open up usually just for very short time periods. Let in a little bit of calcium, you produce regulatory responses to it, and then you chuck it out. So the cells do spend a lot of energy keeping calcium out. And again, that says something about that this is a very important thing to do. So, okay, so I think, and as you'll see here, there are many effects that you see from different frequencies. So millimeter waves that will be used in 5G activate these VGCCs. The microwave radio frequency waves also do that. Intermediate frequencies do it. Extremely low frequencies like 60 hertz and 50 hertz in our power wiring. And even static electrical fields and static magnetic fields, they all work by activating these VGCCs. So it's really remarkable that we have a single target of the EMFs for all these EMFs. And they do in fact produce similar effects in our bodies, so that's important. That doesn't mean they're equally active, I'd say. Okay, so let's go to the next slide. This is a kind of a two-dimensional model of what these VGCCs look like. And the reason that I'm talking about this is that there is a structure in here called the voltage sensor, which I'm going to argue is extraordinarily sensitive to these EMFs, and that's why these VGCCs are so sensitive to it. Okay, so so if you look at this structure, what do you see? You see this kind of thing, and that kind of thing, and that kind of thing. These look similar to each other, right? These are called domains in the protein, and so we got Roman numeral 1, 2, 3, 4 similar structures. Okay, and what you see here are these cylinders. Okay, we've got blue cylinders and some orange cylinders here. Those are all alpha helices. Okay, they're a structure that occurs in proteins, and it's a helix that kind of forms this cylinder. And the fourth helix in each of these domains is colored orange here. It's not actually colored any differently than any of the others. The orange color is to tell you that it's different. Okay, it's to tell you there's something important about that. And what you can see there is that the orange helix has a whole bunch of positive charges in it. That's what these pluses are in here. And so what's happening, those four helices are collectively the voltage sensor. They are the structure which detects electrical changes across the plasma membrane and opens the channel. And they are also the structure, I will argue, that is impacted by these electromagnetic fields. And so, now there are some things about this two-dimensional model that really are not accurate. I'm using it because you can sort of understand it, not that it's accurate in all respects. But these cylinders are actually tilted in the membrane. They're not sticking out right, So this thing here is the plasma membrane, you can see, and these in particular, these 5 charges are tilted such that they are within the lipid part, the fatty part of the membrane, and that's very important for 2 different reasons here. And they come from 2 different laws of physics. One of them is that this is Coulomb's law. Auguste Coulomb was a French physicist who first enunciated this back in 1784, so 5 years before the French Revolution. And what this says, among other things, is that the forces on these charges are inversely proportional to the dielectric constant in which they occur. Okay, so here's the dielectric constant. The dielectric constant of the fatty part of the membrane is about 1/120th of the dielectric constant of the aqueous parts, the watery things in the cell and outside the cell. So for that reason, the forces on these electric charges are approximately 120 times stronger, okay, than they would be if they were sitting out in the aqueous parts, okay? Now the other thing which is important here is that the plasma membrane has a very high electrical resistance. And so a different law of physics called Ohm's law, that's a German law of physics as opposed to the French one we just talked about, and which was enunciated back in the 1830s. Ohm's law predicts that the electrical gradient across the membrane will be highly amplified, about 3,000-fold. Again, that gives you much stronger forces on these charges, okay? Now, so let's go to the next slide. And so, when you compare the forces on the voltage sensor with forces on singly electrically charged groups in the aqueous parts of our cells and bodies, the forces on the voltage sensor are about 20, that's the number of charges, times 120, that's the dielectric constant, times 3,000, equals 7.2 million times stronger. Right? So the industry claims that these forces are way too weak to do anything. But now we know exactly why they're wrong, okay? It's because the voltage sensor is exquisitely sensitive to these electrical forces. So what we have here is a situation where the biology tells us that these VGCCs are the primary target of the EMFs, and the physics tells us why they are. Okay, so these are both the physics and the biology are pointing in exactly the same direction. Now, you can see, of course, that the safety guidelines don't take any of this into consideration. So this is a gigantic problem with the safety guidelines. And in fact, the fact that, this 7.2 million times gives us a sort of an estimate of how much the safety guidelines are allowing us to be exposed to, why it's too high. Why do I say that? Because, again, the safety guidelines are based on heating. Heating is produced primarily by the forces on singly electrically charged groups in the aqueous parts of our cells and bodies. So this thing is going to be vastly more sensitive. Now, there's an important study that was published by Thankyou et al. In 2016, which showed that you could take isolated plasma membranes, no cells, no nothing, just isolated plasma membranes, and you could expose them to microwave frequency, low intensity radiation, and they activate the VGCCs, just like that, and we can show that. So these are direct effects on this protein acting through the voltage sensor, and so we understand an awful lot about these things, and of course, the industry hates that. Okay, let's go on to the next slide. So how then do we get effects in our bodies? And basically, what I'm going to outline to you, and let me say, everything on this slide is very well documented in the biomedical literature. So so we have the EMFs activating the VGCCs. You get increases in intracellular calcium. That's what this is. So you get increases in intracellular calcium. One of the things that happens when you increase intracellular calcium, you get a lot of calcium signaling. So calcium signaling is very, very important in the cells of our bodies. And when you get way too much of it, that can produce damaging, that is, pathophysiological effects. You can also have effects because this increased intracellular calcium causes increases in nitric oxide and superoxide. These two react with each other to form peroxynitrite, which is a potent oxidant. It breaks down to form highly reactive free radicals and produce oxidative stress. And these in turn activate something called NF-kappa B, which produces a lot of inflammation. So you get all these things can then have effects, can help produce the pathophysiological effects. So those are important. Now, I just want to point one other thing out here, however. There are genuine therapeutic effects of EMFs when they are at an appropriate level and when they are focused on a particular part of the body that needs some help. You can have therapeutic effects of these EMFs. And they're thought to work through this pathway, the nitric oxide signaling pathway, that then activates something called NERV2, can produce therapeutic effects. What's peculiar about this is the following. The industry doesn't talk at all about this stuff because they want to maintain the fiction that nothing's going on, even though these can be favorable effects. And so we live in a strange world. Let's go on. Okay. So you've seen that there are 8 different types of evidence which test the predictions of the safety guidelines, including Canada Safety Code 6. In each case, the safety guidelines fail and fail massively to predict biological effects and therefore predict safety. We have, therefore, a multi-trillion-dollar set of companies, the telecommunications industry. All of these claims of safety are based on failed safety guidelines and are therefore fraudulent. Next slide. EMFs are more active in children than they are in adults for 4 different reasons. One is that children have much higher surface to volume ratios, and in particular their brains, which are a major target, are much more exposed, partly because their skulls are much thinner. And so children are more sensitive for that reason. Children have high densities of stem cells. And I mentioned before that there are differences in different cell types. Stem cells are very sensitive to the EMFs, And therefore, children are much more affected because they have these high densities of stem cells. And the younger they are, the higher the densities. This has been discussed by Dr. Igor Belyaev and his colleagues. The developing brain appears to be especially sensitive, and I'll talk about that later. Young tissues have much greater extracellular water content than older tissues, and that leads to deeper penetration of the effects. And this has been discussed by Dr. Deborah Davis. For these reasons, Wi-Fi and cell phone tower radiation in schools are both of very special concern, and so because of the much higher effects on children. Next slide. Okay. Now, we talked about a whole bunch of biological effects before. There are 4 others I want to mention briefly. Here we don't have the kind of absolutely massive evidence that we had with the others, but we still have very substantial evidence. And those include the impact of EMFs to produce very early onset Alzheimer's and other dementias. I'll talk about that later. ADHD and autism may be caused by late prenatal and early postnatal EMF exposures, and I'll talk about that shortly. And then we also have electromagnetic hypersensitivity, where we have substantial evidence that this is caused by EMF exposures in certain situations. So, okay, so let's go back to 5G. We talked before about 5G and the stunning amounts of pulsations that it will entail, and therefore the dangers of it. But we have other things that are important as well. Basically, when we have these, huge numbers of antennae in close proximity to our homes, schools, hospitals, businesses, almost everything, it's of course pretty close to impossible to avoid these exposures. And so that's a major issue. And let me just say, 5G millimeter waves, the industry claims that 5G produces large effects but just on the surface. They do, it does in fact produce, millimeter waves that are going to be used here do produce large effects near the surface of the body, but they also produce penetrating effects. They penetrate at least 20 times more deeply than the industry claims is possible. And I suspect, in fact, it goes much further than that. So you do get effects in organs that are deep in the body. We have, so each of those are major concerns in terms of health impacts. And then we also have the question of the severe effects near the outer parts of the body. So let's go on to the next slide. So what I'm doing here now is I'm giving you my 5 worst nightmares. Okay? What I'm going to talk about is 5 ways in which I think 5G radiation can greatly exacerbate things that are already going on and is likely to destroy us very quickly for each of these 5 reasons. Okay? So let's talk about, one of those things has to do very early onset Alzheimer's and other dementias, okay? So we know that excessive intracellular calcium has essential roles in causing Alzheimer's disease and other neurodegenerative diseases, okay? So there are a whole bunch of published reviews on this. And there are some epidemiological studies that suggest that people exposed to EMFs occupationally have higher incidences of Alzheimer's disease. And we also have evidence that EMFs produce large increases in this amyloid beta protein. This is a protein that has a key role in causing Alzheimer's in isolated neurons. So you take isolated neurons and expose them to EMFs, and you get high amounts of this protein. And as I said, this has key roles in causing Alzheimer's disease. The critical observations here, I think, are these 2 observations that I've got listed here. So there were 2 studies done in rats which showed that you can take a series of short pulses, EMF pulses, exposed the rats as young rats to a whole series of short pulses, and then they stopped exposing them. And they waited until these rats were more the equivalent of sort of middle-aged rats, actually pretty early middle-aged rats. And they looked at them, and what they found was those rats seemed to have very early onset Alzheimer's disease. And what led them to that conclusion is the rats have memory problems and behavioral problems that are at least similar to what you see in human Alzheimer's patients. They also have very high levels of the amyloid beta protein in their brains, and of course normal rats do not. And they also have high levels of oxidative stress in their brains, and again, normal rats of that age do not. So all you need to do to convert perfectly normal rats into very early onset Alzheimer's rats is to give them a series of short EMF pulses as young rats. That is all you need to do to get 100% conversion. So that's about as stunning as almost anything you can imagine. I think that, now obviously I don't know for certain that 5G is going to cause these things in humans. But we have every reason to expect that they will. And to go ahead and do these things without any biological safety tests is, which is what is being pushed on us, and I've described this before as being frankly insane. Okay, let's go on the next one. That's number one. Number two has to do with autism, and so the sequence I'm going to talk about most is this sequence over here, where you get low-intensity EMFs activating the VGCCs, you get increases in intracellular calcium, and that in turn impacts the formation of synapses in the developing brain, okay? So autism is thought to be caused by the impact on the synapse formation in the developing brain. And specifically, there is a tremendous amount of synapse formation that occurs in the perinatal period, in the period just before birth and after birth. And so the typical the typical neuron in the brain has something like 1,000 synapses. It's connected in 1,000 different ways to other neurons. So there's a huge amount of activity going on to form these synapses. The synaptic formation is regulated by 5 different mechanisms, which I have listed here. And all 5 of those mechanisms are known to be regulated by intracellular calcium, by this guy. So when you get way too much intracellular calcium, it's going to disrupt this synapse formation. And we know that in fact occurs in autism, and probably to a much lesser extent in ADHD. So this is a highly plausible sequence. We know that excessive VGCC activity can cause autism. We know that both from rare mutations and from genetic polymorphism studies in the human population. And there's also a literature which shows that excessive intracellular calcium has important roles in causing autism as well. So, mechanistically this makes sense. Now, it's also true that various chemicals can act along this pathway to increase intracellular calcium. And so I'm not saying there are no chemical effects. Having said that, it's my opinion that this is the main pathway that's going on, that's driving the autism epidemic rather than that one. And the reason is that many of these chemicals that act along this pathway, their synthesis went up. There were huge increases in the synthesis of those chemicals during the 30 years following World War II, and that was before the autism epidemic really got started. So I think that this is the primary driver, but the chemicals also have roles. And in fact, they may in fact act synergistically together. Next slide. So we also have DNA damage of 3 different types we discussed before. You get single-strand and double-strand DNA breaks. You get oxidized bases in the DNA, and these then can cause both cancer and germline mutations. And I mentioned before, you get these in human sperm in response to EMF exposures. And so one of my main concerns really is, are we essentially destroying what's called, the human gene pool? Are we producing so many mutations in the human gene pool that we'll basically become extinct for that reason? Because as I say, a lot of the EMFs that we're already exposed to, we know are quite active in that. And of course the prediction is that 5G radiation will be vastly more active. And so, we could probably destroy the human gene pool perhaps in months from 5G radiation. So anyway, okay, so let's go on. Lowered fertility is another thing. Yeah, this is kind of amazing, isn't it? Lowered fertility is another thing that's going on. We have all these things going on in humans, and in some cases they've only been studied in animals. So you get changes in the structure of the testis and the ovaries, lowered sperm count, lowered sperm motility, lowered sperm quality, lowered numbers of eggs. You get increases in spontaneous abortion, you get lowered levels of each of the 3 sex hormones, and you get lowered libido. So all those things are going on, and so then the question is, okay, how far along are these in our societies? How far along are these? So there was a study published at the end of 2017 by Levine et al. Showing that sperm counts have dropped in every single technologically advanced society on Earth to below 50% of normal. Think about that. And so, so this is an absolutely stunning result. Now, I can't tell you for certain that the EMFs are causing this, but we know the EMFs can cause this, and we know that high-level EMF exposures is occurring in all of those technologically advanced societies, and we simply do not have any other hypothesis that explains this. Okay? Anyway, so reproduction in those societies has dropped well below replacement levels in every single one of them, with one exception. They averaged about 73% of replacement levels in 2016, and we have studies in animals that show that safety guidelines that EMFs, well within our safety guidelines, can cause crashes in reproduction in animals to 0 within 90 days to 150 days, depending on the exposures. Okay. Now things go faster in animals than they do in us, so we're probably, so this is all very, very stunning. So the question I've asked are we seeing any signs of crashes in human populations? And I think we are in 3 densely populated, high technology East Asian countries. Singapore had a 31% drop in reproduction between 2016 and 2017. Macau, which isn't really a separate country, but it has separate statistics, had a 26% drop in reproduction, again, same years, 2016 to 2017. South Korea had an 11% drop in reproduction, same years, and then had another approximate 9% drop in the first half of 2018. Korean government's been trying to stimulate reproduction using public policy, and as you can see, it's totally failed. So, so again, I can't tell you for certain that these are EMF driven, but that's, again, is the obvious interpretation. We're taking risks of the sort that no rational society can possibly take, and we're taking them over and over and over and over again. And that is, I would expect that we're all going to go over the reproductive cliff completely apart from 5G. completely apart from further rollout of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars to irradiate it still further. But each of these things, and especially 5G, will probably, cause these things to plummet probably in months rather than years. That's, yeah, okay, so let's go on to the next slide. We have neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, what are they? Insomnia, fatigue, depression, headache, lack of concentration, cognitive dysfunction, anxiety, stress, agitation, memory dysfunction, and when you study animals, you find major changes in the structure of the brains. So we think these brain changes are what's underlying these neurological and neuropsychiatric effects, and we believe both of them occur cumulatively with time. That is, they become more and more severe with time of exposure to a particular type and intensity of exposure. And as they become more severe, they become irreversible. That is, the evidence from the literature is that in people, in animals, both, if you take them out of the fields, at least this was true in people back in the 1970s when you could actually take people out of the fields, it's practically impossible to do that. You could get a recovery if you have modest effects. As the effects become more and more severe, they become irreversible, and they become absolutely massive. So so our entire society is threatened by this. I predicted about a year ago that we could easily have a crash in our collective brain function in something like 5 to 7 years, based on the exposures we already have, completely apart from all these new ones. And that was based on occupational exposure studies in humans and also the animal studies. If that estimate is correct, then we're talking about more like 4 to 6 years. These estimates are rough. They could easily be off by a factor 2 in either direction. That doesn't give us much room for confidence here, especially if we do something as stupid as, putting 5G out. We could easily crash in months. And so my prediction is we're basically going to go, everything's dependent on our collective brain function. We will go into utter chaos if our collective brain function goes to hell. So there are, I think, a lot of ecological effects, and I'm not sure if I have time to talk about these. Do I have time to talk about these? 10 minutes, okay, then I got time. Okay, so 5G, let me say, EMFs work in plants very much the same way they work in the cells of our bodies and in animal bodies. They work via calcium and calcium channels. So all kinds of animals, insects, birds, small mammals, etc., will be highly sensitive to 5G radiation, as are, I believe, most plants. And so 5G radiation will use millimeter waves, higher frequencies. They will have the highest impacts right near the surface of the body. So organisms with high surface to volume ratios will be particularly heavily impacted. But that doesn't mean that you're not getting effects deep in the body. You do, in fact, get effects deep in the body. So there were a couple of U.S. patents that were taken out, issued for the using millimeter waves. These were not pulsed millimeter waves like 5G. These were non-pulsed. And it was shown that they have very high activity as insecticides. They kill off insects very efficiently. And in these two U.S. patents, so they were arguing, well, we should use millimeter waves as insecticides. What that does to the favorable insects, including bees, of course, is, it obviously raises huge questions. There were reports from the Netherlands in 5G tests that were linked to large numbers of bird fatalities of apparent sudden cardiac death. And so that's another thing that may well be going on here from these exposures. Let's look at the next slide. And one of the things that I've discussed is that one of the impacts on plants, and plants again, it goes through calcium in the cell, and one of the things that happens when you get high levels of calcium in the cell, it causes many plants to produce very high levels of highly volatile, highly flammable terpenes. And in fact, it's been reported that this can occur from EMF exposures in plants. And so what does that do? Well, it makes the plants very highly flammable. It's a little bit like spraying plants with a light spray of gasoline. So it's my belief that much of the problems with the California fires that we've seen are probably caused more by EMFs than by climate change, because of the stunning heat that's been involved in those fires. And so the only way you can get stunning heat in fires is to have highly flammable things being burned. And that's exactly what the EMFs do. So, so I've been predicting that, because of this, the 5G will probably cause massive fires. We may have seen the first 5G fires in Korea, and I say may have, or that implies we may not have. But Korea was the first country to proudly announce 5G rollout. And along the east coast of Korea, just a few weeks ago, there were 5 massive fires in 5 of the smaller cities along that coast where they had 5G rollouts. So, are those 5G fires? Well, we can't say for certain yet, but it's certainly suspicious. My overall assessment here is the following, that we will see massive ecological impacts, and I have to say I'm not an ecologist, and I have limited abilities to imagine how all these things are going to occur, but I think we will see collapses of whole ecosystems because such a very large fraction of the organisms in those ecosystems will be highly affected. So, let's go. Next slide. Well, I guess I have a few minutes to discuss this, so I'll take a few minutes. One of the questions about this, and one of the real puzzles about this, I think, is why is the telecom industry doing all this? I mean, it's not like we're out there crying for 5G. I don't know of any individuals that are saying, oh, we really need to download videos, in a couple of seconds instead of waiting a few more seconds to download it the way we've been doing it before. And so, it's not clear. And 5G is not going to be used for voice anyway, so that's all going to be 4G. So why does the industry want to do this? And it's been a real puzzle. I think there are a number of articles in the press, particularly in the financial press, that have suggested that 5G makes sense as a conduit for artificial intelligence information. So let's think about that for a minute. If you have a high-powered computer somewhere with software for doing artificial intelligence, processing, and you're trying to control something out in the periphery where things may be changing from second to second, which you need to respond to those changes very rapidly, what do you need? You need, of course, a bunch of sensors out there to measure what changes are occurring. You need to transmit the information from those sensors to the AI computer, and you need to do that very rapidly because you don't want to spend a lot of time. You don't want to wait a lot of time. The AI computer then has to do the processing. It then has to send back the information to drones or robots or whatever is responding to it, again, to rapidly respond. So the speed of 5G makes some sense in that context. What makes more sense is to use actually wired connections, which can be used even faster and are less susceptible to hacking and don't impact our health the way 5G radiation inevitably will. So, why you're doing this is, of course, So, so you can use things like Wi-Fi, as suggested here, much more easily, rather than using 5G radiation, which is dangerous. So, so the one thing I want to emphasize here is the following. If we develop artificial intelligence using 5G, the inevitable impact of the 5G radiation on our brains will mean that human intelligence will be potently negatively impacted at the same time that the telecom industry is pushing 5G for AI. Think about that. All right, let's go let's go on and okay. So yeah, let's just go to the last slide, I guess. We can do that. Summary. 5G presents threats of a sort that have only been equaled, in my judgment, once in human history, and that being the threat of instant nuclear annihilation. 5G must be stopped because failure to do so may well spell the demise of our species and probably everything we care about on this planet. So, thank you very much.
Hello, I'm Liz Walker. I've been involved in the environmental movement now since 1990, and I was introduced to this topic back in early 2000 when Rogers had a contract with the Surrey School District to put cell antenna on top of my son's high school. That was a 1.5-year battle, but we did get the school district to cancel the contract. And since then, I've stayed connected with this issue. Now, I recently received notice of a new Rogers application down at 120th and Colebrook Road, which is right next to the Boundary Bay Wildlife Management Area. I'm keenly interested and concerned about this because I'm also president of the White Rock and Surrey Naturalists, and looking after nature is something that we do. Now, this is for a 40-meter tower. It's one of those huge ones. And as you heard from Dr. Pall, there's very real ecological concerns. Up to now, well, we keep hearing there's really not much we can say. They will only listen to us if we say that it's ugly. We don't like the look of it. But of course, the majority of people are concerned about health effects and the environment. So there's a deadline of July 15th to comment on this tower. And I would like to suggest that you, all of you, and you get your friends, people you know, to write to your local MP and to write to the Innovation, Science and Economic Development Ministry and tell them this is enough. No more. This is going to put another layer of radiation that's going to impact our environment. And those of you who live here, you know how important Boundary Bay is, how important this region is part of the Pacific Flyway. There's millions of birds that migrate through here. We talked about insects. Well, insects are an important food resource for all of those migratory birds that come through. So anyway, I'm just going to leave it there. I do have a form at the back. What did I call it? Oh, what to do now. I do have the ministry's email website address in there for contact. So if you want to pick up one of those, that's one of the ways to get started on that. Okay, any more questions? I'll be back at the back of the room before you leave. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin, for your speech today. My name is Amy, and I'm a fairly newly elected politician in the Okanagan area of British Columbia.
Thank you for coming.
Oh, thanks. Specifically, I'm a school trustee, and I also, for a while, have had just intuitive concerns about Wi-Fi technology, but I'm starting to look into the more scientific data behind it. But when I express any of these concerns to my colleagues, usually I'm just brushed off. And even coming here today, they sort of gave a little laugh and said, you know, good for you, hope you learned something. But what I'm really hoping for, first of all, what my colleagues want is a lot of peer-reviewed articles, peer-reviewed literature. And so my problem there is that I don't have those reviews that you were linking,
Yeah.
or you were referencing, and so...
Well, we can talk about that. Yeah, okay, so I have written a document on the safety guidelines, and you can find that document probably by searching under my name, Martin Pall, P-A-L-L, and safety guidelines and 5G. They have all of the reviews that I listed there are in that document. And of course, most of those reviews are peer-reviewed, not all of them, but each of them cites many peer-reviewed articles. You know, the problem we have, and I want to say this forthrightly with regard to organizations like Health Canada, like IGNERP, like the Center organization in Europe and the US FCC, is that they systematically avoid looking at exactly those studies. And so they avoid looking at all of the most important evidence. And that's been true for at least a couple of decades. So, you know, it's fine to look at those things. Yeah, we should look at those. But then why are these organizations that are supposed to be protecting our health failing to do so?
So can I ask one more follow-up question then? Is there any way to organize this information so that we, like you said, there's a list of all these studies, but in a way that makes it really accessible to the general population, so we can have a list of the studies, who's done them, the dates they were published, what universities they were done at, and then sort of a brief, you know, abstract of each of those studies?
Well, you'll have to look up the abstract yourself. Are they in here? All right.
And our website too, at CETH.ca.
Yeah, they've got, I guess, and I haven't looked at this, but you've got, what, 1,670 peer-reviewed scientific papers on EMF effects on that website.
Say the website on the mic, please.
So what?
Say the website to the mic.
It's CETH.ca.
It's right there on the poster, over there, all over the internet, that's the website, right?
Yeah, so you can get those, okay.
Okay, I didn't see them there myself, but
Yeah.
I'm just looking for them because people aren't
Right.
going to listen to us if we don't
No,
have this
I understand
information
that. I understand
organized and collected and out there.
Yeah.
So
mhm.
that's my main problem. And
Yeah.
if you guys care about it too, then we all need to somehow work together to get this information out there.
Yeah.
Otherwise, people are just going to look at us like we're tinfoil people. So it
Yeah.
needs to be really well documented.
Yeah, let me just say one other thing about that. I wrote a 90-page document that was put on the internet. It's dated May 17, 2018. You can also find that on the internet by searching. It is it is about 5G and on EMFs generally. One of the things that's in that 90-page document are two chapters, Chapter 5 and Chapter 6, which discuss the corruption of the science that has gone on in this area. So Chapter 5 is about the center organization, which has been the most important one in Europe, and how they have corrupted the science. And Chapter 6 is about all the corruption in the US. So these are things that these people should read, because they should know what level of corruption is going on of the science. And so those two chapters are actually over 60% of the text of that 90-page document. So, and they are that big because they had to be that big in order to convey anything like the kind of corruption that's going on. People need to read that. So you can get that off the internet too. And that's something that they should look at.
Dr. Paul, you mentioned something about the increased use of radar in motor cars. Could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Increased use of, I'm sorry?
Radar?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you know, the whole idea of having self-driving cars or even cars that will park themselves, etc., use radar. You know, those use radar. So we will be exposed, and in fact, other motorists will be exposed to very high amounts of radiation from radar, and that's a major concern.
And the second question is, are some of the slides in the book?
No, they're not. No.
Okay.
No, I will be making some of these slides available, but we haven't developed that as an organized thing yet. So
Okay.
yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I'm seeing a correlation between this and also what's going on in the science about climate change and the fact that these things can even be debatable. And what it seems to point to, which is a complete aberration, is either humanity is suicidal, like we somehow subconsciously want to eliminate ourselves, or there's some kind of force, something that is consciously plotting this type of destruction on us. It doesn't seem possible that this type of thing is just accidental, and it's deeply concerning, deeply shocking that this is going on, of course. But the urgency of it is amazing, you know. And I mean, the question is, how isolated are you in the scientific community? Are there other scientists who are taking your stand, and are you supported in the work that you're doing?
Well, let me just say that, first of all, you know, with regard to the independent scientists in this area, there have been 42 statements that have been put out by groups of independent scientists and physicians who have professional expertise in this area, expressing high-level concern about the safety guidelines because they only protect us from thermal effects and not from non-thermal effects. So that part of it is not at all controversial at all. I mean, there is nothing, you know, the other thing I would say is that, you know, in science, it's almost unheard of for everybody to accept everything, you know, instantaneously. I mean, that simply doesn't happen. The first paper that I wrote on EMFs, it was published in 2013, so quite recently, it's been cited 225 times according to the Google Scholar database. So there has been a tremendous amount of interest in this from other scientists. The other thing I would say is I have given 48 invited professional talks on EMFs in 11 different countries, and I'm now scheduled to give quite a number of others between now and the end of November. So again, there's been a tremendous amount of interest in the science, among scientists in this. And you know, and that, you know, that's obviously important. So I don't feel isolated at all in that sense. I mean, but that doesn't mean everybody accepts everything I have to say, and I want to make that very clear, yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paul. My question is, how can we really help to, because there must be a big financial push behind the business that doesn't want to know somewhere that is overriding what you're trying to bring forward.
Mm-hmm.
And so how, it seems that we need to really work out of this humanity for the society rather than business interests. And how would you, how can we really do this? We need to get the will to, we need the will to do the work, to make the understanding that comes really from humanity, because this is affecting humanity as a whole into the future.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I don't know that we have to look at this as if all industries are on the other side. But there are an awful lot of industries that are sitting on the side that shouldn't be sitting on the side, and they will be impacted as well. And I always think about when I see, some particular industry that goes into a rapid decline, whether their brain function's already been impacted, and that's what we're looking at. And we've seen a number of examples of that, just within the last, 6 months to a year. So, such as Boeing. And Boeing employees probably have pretty high EMF exposures. Their brains are going to hell. That's the way it is. There are many other groups that have particularly high exposures that I'm very concerned about. And they include, for instance, the TSA agents, when we go through the airports, and they're having health effects. They include police, who have very high exposures in police cars and police stations. So there are many examples of those kinds of things. And you see effects, and that of course doesn't prove that everything you're seeing is caused by EMFs, but that's at least a reasonable hypothesis. So I think maybe as somebody who's not a citizen of Canada anymore, maybe I shouldn't make comments, but if you've got an election coming up, if you've got groups of people who raise this issue over and over and over again with officials who want to get reelected, they may start responding in ways that may surprise us. And so, but you need groups of people to do this. You can't do this as an individual, and I think that's essential. So anyway, okay.
I wanted to first say thank you very much to you and everybody who organized this.
Mm-hmm.
I think personally, from just doing some research, is one of the huge reasons why 5G is foisted on us is for AI and technocracy. And I'd like to recommend this book. I just started reading it. It's called Technocracy Rising, and it's the Trojan Horse of Global Transformation, written by a gentleman by the name of Patrick M. Wood. And there's a very, very informative, eye-opening website called www.technocracynews.com, and it explains the real intention behind 5G and for mass surveillance and technocratic control on the most centralized basis. So,
thank you.
very eye-opening. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I have a comment that I really want to make. Yesterday, Dr. Pall, you mentioned the generational sequence of mice exposed to a particular tower. You didn't mention that today.
I'm sorry?
The mice, the dysfunctional generational sequence in mice that were exposed to cell towers, how many generations they went before they had no reproductive. Could you mention that?
Yeah, that was the so what was done, so first of all, they were exposed actually to broadcast radiation. And they were exposed to the EMFs on the ground in an antenna park. So there are a series of broadcasting antennas, and on the ground level, the levels were well within our safety guidelines, so nothing should happen, right? And so they actually looked at two different locations where, higher level here and a lower level there, but all within our safety guidelines. A litter in mice takes 30 days. They're quick. And they can produce another litter, you know, almost 30 days later. So what was found with the higher level exposure, they had one litter, lowered numbers, second litter, lowered numbers, no third litter. Complete sterility in about 90 days. All within our safety guidelines. What happened at the lower level exposure was basically the same pattern, except it was the fifth litter that crashed to zero. The crash to zero was apparently either irreversible or almost completely irreversible, in the sense when you take the mice out of the fields, you see only the very, very slightest recovery of reproductive function. So that's what was found, and that was why, you know, I've been looking to see if there's any evidence of something similar going on in human populations. And of course, you know, in the mice, they were, you know, each group was exposed to a uniform exposure. And we have more variation from one individual to another. So you don't expect to see, you know, the crash to affect everybody at the same time. But I want to say, when we have a situation where sperm counts have dropped to below 50% of normal in every single technologically advanced country on Earth, it's time to stop pretending that the vast majority of us are not already being impacted by this stuff. I mean, it's clear that the vast majority of us are, in fact, being impacted. And that's, you know, again, completely apart from 5G, completely apart from further expansion of 4G, completely apart from putting radar units in cars, and all of the other things that are being planned for us.
Okay, now to my real point. You know, we can talk about this until the cows come home unless we decide to do something. And I'd like to ask for a show of hands here. If we could provide you with a DVD with this information that you could play in your living room to 10 or 15 of your neighbors or friends, etc., how many would be willing to do that? Yeah. Okay, great. Now, if each one of those, we have about 150 people here. If each one of those 10 people, or these 150 people, were to encourage the 10 people that they invite to do the same thing, how long does it take to cover your local area with this information? Now, that's the reason I asked for the telephone numbers and the names. There are a few people who haven't signed it yet. Because we have to do something, we have to do something fast, but we have to do it on a local level. Asking people to go to the internet, which is censoring information on 5G, censoring information on GMO, censoring information on vaccines, censoring information on everything that we have to know. So we have to do it ourselves. So this is the reason. If you haven't given me your telephone number and name, please do so. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I just first of all think that I think we have a good future ahead of us. I look at the gun control lobby in the States, I look at Greta Thunberg and I follow her, and I think we have the sense that we can't change things. But I think the biggest problem often with very in-depth scientific things that take really educated people to understand is that there's maybe only 1 in 1,000 of us, for everybody in the city of Surrey, that likes to look at graphs and really intense scientific stuff. What we need is a coalition of communicators that work with the scientists, between the regular public. I know the scientists have formed groups of 170 scientists, you know, in the world, and get together regularly to try to get that message across. But you need that intermediary who can use infographics, very simple ways of getting the message across to people. And, you know, and I think that's where we fail. And there almost needs to be a school that teaches people how to get really complex information across in a very simple way to people. And I loved your presentation because I love to kind of force my brain to learn more. But I've got to tell you, my neighborhood would not watch this or even care to listen. So instead they look at any kind of mainstream information they get tidbits of. And they're not investigators, they don't. And I sometimes think, keeping it so simple, when you think about like the climate change thing, what Greta's doing, it took a very few simple words. And and sometimes we try to make things, to get our messages across with so many words. So it's just a message for anyone here who's scientific, is keep it simple. And it's not a question, it's just a message, so that anybody in this room who might be a science writer or someone who could get together with other science writers and maybe start to find a way to communicate the information in simpler terms, and with no disrespect, because I appreciated what I heard today and it made sense to me. I felt it showed your credibility, but to the general public, it doesn't help. I'm sorry.
It's wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, I just, let me just make one comment about that. I do think we're starting to make some progress with regard to the media. It's still nowhere near where it should be, but to the extent that each of us have some influence with regard to the media, we need to start expressing that to them. They need to start covering this, and they are starting to cover it, but it's still a tiny fraction of what it should be. So anyway, and you know, with regard to what people hear, what they hear typically is what the industry wants them to hear. They hear propaganda, not science. Yeah.
Paul was just saying that the Peace Arts News on Friday had an article on G5. Well, that's awesome. Right.
Hi, thanks for doing this and for taking time to take my question. You brushed over the NRF2 pathway twice on there, and so I'm just wondering if you know of anything like oxidative stress, that's the pathway that it uses to be damaged or to heal. Do you know of anything that takes that pathway to help neutralize the effects of this 5G technology that takes that pathway?
Okay. So first of all, I have a paper out on NRF2, and it does a lot more than just lower oxidative stress. And so you can get that paper full text at no cost. Just go into PubMed, P-U-B-M-E-D, and put my name and NRF2, and you'll get it. It doesn't cost anything. So there are many things, but yeah, I do think that raising NRF2 is useful in lowering EMF effects. And there are a number of published studies that suggest that that's true.
The question is,
Yeah.
do you know of anything that could help reduce that oxidative stress that takes that pathway?
Well, yeah, raising NRF2 lowers oxidative stress, but it also lowers a lot of other things that are raised. It lowers inflammation. It improves the function of the mitochondria, which is something else that's going on here. So there are a number of things that acts to lower the effects of the EMFs. It's not a magic bullet. That's the problem. The problem is when you look at something as massive as 5G, there are, you know, it's just, yeah, it'll just overwhelm us. So yeah.
I think I'm not asking my question properly. Is there a way to contact you to talk about this more?
Well, I mean, I have an email address. I'm not sure that, you know, if I get too many emails, I won't be able to respond to them. So, I don't know. Yeah.
Just want to gonna take a few more.
The only language that industry understands is money. So, do we have to wait for the human damage before suing the industry that would, in a way that would make them stop doing these things?
Well, let me just say something about that. The damage is already here. For some reason, the industry's been pretty effective in hiding it, but let me give you some examples. There are 17 studies that have been done on people living near cell phone towers. Each of them shows that there are health impacts on those people. Typically, people who live within 300 meters of a cell phone tower, which is a large fraction of the population. The latest review on that stated that people living within 400 meters of a cell phone tower have a remarkable increase in cancer. And so there's a lot of stuff going on already, we know, and that's just one of the EMFs that we know are producing effects. We know cell phones produce effects, we know that Wi-Fi produces effects, we know that smart meters produce effects. You know, I mean, there's lots of stuff already going on, and it's just simply wrong to say that, as the industry says, and as Health Canada says, that nothing's going on.
Hi, Professor. I'm glad to see you today again, and thank you for yesterday's presentation in Vancouver. It was phenomenal, and today as well. It's an eye-opener, and I don't have a question. I have a message. And the message is, thank you, Amy, if she's still here. The message is, thank you, Inga, for organizing us, and thank you to this gentleman that asked the question, why is this happening? And we know why it is happening. But the other question is, what are we willing to do now? Because there is little time and there is a lot of danger. So, to that lady that asked, how can we organize? I'm ready to give my voice, my face, my intelligence. Please, let's get together. Let's do something with Paul. And all of us that believe we can do something. Thank you.
Hi, thank you, Paul, for bringing this to my attention. Do you know of any effects on the microbiome or pathogenic microbes was one question, and the other I wanted to ask is, should I wear an EMF suit to work, or do you know of any ways that are effective at blocking EMS without changing our environment?
Well, I mean, you can wear an EMF suit. You're going to look like a freak, but that may be more important than anything else. So,
Makes it could look beautiful.
Sorry, what was the other question?
Microbiome.
Well, there are impacts on bacteria that have been studied, but I don't think we know as much about how they work in bacteria as we do in animals and plants. There is some information about that, though. I'm not saying there's none. And there are impacts on yeast and fungi, for instance. So, those are probably more like what are going on in the cells of our bodies. EMFs basically impact every single living organism. And the safety guidelines are a joke. Okay.
I'd like to thank you too, and it is true that much of the technical aspects of this speech went above my head, but I still think it does a lot of good, and I appreciate you being here with your message. One of the things that I was wondering about is when you said about the response rate curve, and I found it interesting that it's this sort of like this one point, if you will, or not really a point, but it's this curve, I gather, maybe. Are there any hypotheses as to how it is that works? And I just wonder if that would give some sort of insight into the 5G problem or the EMF problem.
That's a good question. Let me just say, first of all, that there are there are studies that have been done where they showed actually multiple windows. Okay, I think one of them showed 5 different windows at different frequency ranges. So these, the dose response curves are extraordinarily complex. Since I think that most of these things go through the voltage sensor, that may well be at least part of the explanation here. And the voltage sensor is a structure that actually goes through multiple changes. There are multiple conversions. And so the forces on those charges may influence each of the changes that occur. And so you may have some things that actually inhibit the activation and others that produce increased activation. And so it may be, some of those complexities may come into this. That's speculation, but it's reasonable speculation.
You've given us the cause, you've given us the effects. How about protection? In our home, what we do, we unplug our Wi-Fi every night completely, and we got tin foil around the inside of the electrical meter on the inside to reduce that. But I got a little meter, and it's our neighbor, his house smart,
Yeah.
It's right next to our house, and we got lots of
Yeah.
EMFs from our neighbors, not even us. So,
Right.
is there other ways you could tell us how to maybe make our house safe instead of smart?
Well, there are a lot of ways that you can do this. You know, each of them, of course, takes work. One of the things that I suggest to people is that they should consider using graphite paint as a shield. Graphite paint has the advantage that it basically absorbs the EMFs, and so you know, if you're getting things coming from, you know, through your walls, you can put graphite paint on the walls. Graphite paint is black. If you don't like looking at black walls, and I don't know anybody who does, you want to cover it up with another color paint, but you can do that and it still works. So, you know, so that's one approach. You can put things over your windows to try to cut down exposures. Also, there are fabrics that you can buy that have a lot of little metal fibers that help shield the windows. So you basically have a light curtain there that can cut things down. So those are things that can happen. There are many other ways in which you can improve things, and you know, I mean, part of the problem is that, you know, a lot of the exposures we really don't need. I mean, we don't need Wi-Fi for anything. You know, you can do everything wired, and we should be doing everything wired, except perhaps under rare conditions where we have to be mobile at the time. And you know, and you know, we can start boycotting organizations that have got Wi-Fi there. That might help a little bit once they get the word out. But you know, it's going to be a long battle, and I don't know. You know, you can wear clothing that's shielded. If you cover your head, you're going to look pretty weird to most people, but maybe people get used to it after a while.
Thank you. We actually built our 100 foam, and we've actually put the hard wire in. But scientists also told us we should probably have tin foil in our bedroom against the wall where we sleep.
Yeah, well, tin foil is, okay, so aluminum foil basically reflects EMFs. It doesn't absorb it. So you have to be a little bit concerned about what it's reflecting where. And so, for example, you put up aluminum foil on your walls, it will reflect EMFs that you're generating in the house back into the house. That can be problematic. If you put it, you know, if you're bouncing it off, you know, then of course it depends on what's on the other side as to whether you're going to care about that.
That's where it's coming from the other side.
Yeah, right, I understand that. So, you know, so it can be useful, but you know, you have to be a little bit concerned about that from that standpoint. That's all I'm saying, yeah.
Good luck.
Just wondering if you're familiar with the Swiss shield?
Yeah, that's one of the fabrics that's used as a shield because it has a lot of little metal fibers in it.
It's about 87% cotton,
yeah,
1% silver, and 17%, I think, copper.
Mm-hmm.
And it's a fabric. It's like you were mentioning, sort of like a curtain. Or
yeah.
It's a fabric.
Yeah.
And you can see through it.
Yeah. That's right. Yeah.
But that's to be recommended, you think?
I think it's good. You know, there are a lot of others that are somewhat similar, and I haven't really looked at the pros and cons of the different types. So I don't know that I want to say this is the best one, but it is a good one. Yeah.
And one more thing, with fiber optics coming in, is that going to increase the danger in our apartments?
No, it depends on how it's used.
Actually, my question is the same question.
Yeah.
I had the kids coming over, they're from TELUS.
Yeah.
And they're pushing me to change my modem to the fiber optic. So now I said, no, I don't want to be more powerful than them. They said that Shaw is copper and this is much better for us. And then I'm going to get a great deal of $50 a month. So that's a big deal for me. So what is good for me to do? Do I say yes or no?
Well, the problem with having TELUS do that is they're going to use the same fiber optics to run all these small cells.
Because they actually
will
put
do
them
that.
last year. They
Yeah,
already
they'll
put them all
use
in the
them.
neighborhood.
Right.
It's already there.
Yeah. Well.
So what should I say? No.
So you're basically well.
Yes.
I'm not sure I can answer that question. I'm sorry. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, ideally, what you would like to have, and there are pushes to do this in a number of places, including Salt Spring Island, is to have a community-run fiber system, which will go directly to your house. In which case, you're not supporting TELUS and all the horrible things that they're doing. Yeah. Anyway, that's the ideal situation.
Sorry to hear that. Last question, thank you.
Oh yeah, that's a good one. How many countries have stopped all this already?
How many countries have stopped all of this?
have not gone for this advancement support.
I think
Which countries?
I mean, there have been cities and areas that have stopped it, like Brussels and a couple of places in Switzerland and I believe in Italy, Rome and Florence are in the process of stopping this. And most of those have just occurred quite recently. So, and there are many other countries that have movements to stop this, but the question is, will they be successful? And that's an open question. Yeah.
All right, last question from Lauren.
I have to ask this. I work with children, and I've seen a lot of children affected by the Wi-Fi. And I know the mothers, especially the millennial mothers, a lot of them, they don't believe you when you say there's an effect. Is there anything that we can do as people who work with children like that, or, you know, to recommend to the parents to try and help these children to reverse some of the effects that they've had from the 5G or the Wi-Fi? Is there anything you know of that we can give parents to try and help to reverse this autism and all this stuff that's been happening to our babies?
Well, you know, there have been physicians actually who have treated autism patients in part by putting them in a low EMF environment. That seems to be helpful. It's not, you know, it doesn't take care of everything, but it has substantial. You do get substantial improvements. So it's not that you cannot do anything on these, and but you know, of course, it's always tricky with parents. I mean, parents obviously feel, you know, that they're trying to do the best thing for their children, even when they're not, and so. I don't know, you know, I guess I don't know really what to say, except that I think sometimes it is helpful to say something, but you need to give people a little bit of space to kind of come around on these things. And so, yeah.
I want to thank everybody for coming out this afternoon. If a lot of people came together to make all this happen. Phil Watson helped in many ways in providing some money for the advertising. It's much appreciated. Of course, Pixie and Farronlander, for those people who are wanting to figure out how to mitigate some of these problems and get assessments for their home, I would encourage you to look at Healthy Homes. There was a number of other people I wanted to thank. Mickey for the sound system today, for doing the sound, taking care of, and of course Penny Starchild for providing music and your sound system. I'm really encouraged that people came out today. It was a good turnout, and everybody is obviously raising awareness on this important issue. Somebody else earlier in the afternoon, I think it was this gentleman over here, wanted to know about the credibility issue. And there's something on the website called EMF Scientist Appeal, and there were 40 countries with more than 250 scientists that signed that appeal. So there's a lot of scientific credibility, and I would actually put it to you that where the non-credibility exists is actually in the government regulatory agencies. We have to reverse the onus of responsibility here If someone accuses you of being a tinfoil hat, you should present them with the hat, because this is really what's going on. They're accusing you of that which they themselves are guilty. And I don't wish to make it a confrontation. Always be loving when you discuss this, because that's the way you keep dialogue happening. It's better not to do a confrontation. And that's because we're moving towards, this is about caring for people. It really is about love and having a loving community. And if we were not a loving community, we wouldn't care. We wouldn't give a damn. We're caring. And that's why that's the bigger message, and I've always found that that is a much more useful method for communicating this very delicate issue. And I wish I knew I had the secret answer for the secret formula, the secret sauce to making parents understand Wi-Fi in particular in schools. There are organizations of parents that have come together. It's to encourage them to check that out, because I think it's a question of psychological inertia. Again, thank you for Dr. Pall for coming for this tour. 7 cities, amazing.
Can I make one last comment? One of the things, you know, you're asking about credibility and the like. You can't get insurance to cover liability on this stuff, except at extraordinarily high cost that can be cut off very quickly. Most of the insurance companies will not touch this with a 10-foot pole. That should tell anyone who questions your credibility that there is some real genuine concern about liability issues here. And so, you know, this is something that, you know, they like to do all the time. They like to say, oh, it's the activists that say this thing. What about the hard-headed insurance companies that will not touch this stuff?
So I again thank you for everybody coming. There's going to be hopefully a legal challenge, and I wanted very last thing I wanted to mention to you that there's going to be an effort in the United States on, I believe, either July 27th or 28th. They're doing days of action in the United States against 5G. We're hoping to organize something in Vancouver on the same day, if we can figure out and confirm the actual date. We're not sure about the details yet. It might be at a TELUS facility, we're not sure. But if you go to the website CETH.ca, we will try to keep you all posted on all of this stuff. We have to vacate the building by 5 p.m., so I appreciate your cooperation. No. Thanks again.